There was some thought about having a similar institution in France. It was decided not to. And what happened? Well, France and Spain had Spain and Portugal rather had the Inquisition, and some few heretics in the end absolutely refused to give up whatever their heresy was, were handed over to the secular arm, and were executed. But Spain and Portugal did not undergo civil wars. France refused that sort of thing. And the result, I'm sorry to say, were the horrible wars of religion, starting with the War of the Three Henries in the early 1500s, in the mid 1500s, and going on really until about 1590. It was a terrible thing. It devastated France. Spain and Portugal were spared that. The religious conflicts in Germany and the British Isles, of course, were similarly bloody. I'm willing to say that because of the Inquisition, Spain and Portugal were spared all of that bloodshed. I know that's not a very popular thing to say, but that's where we are. That's what it was.
You can always watch entire episodes under the Our Shows tab at vmpr.org.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, as we mentioned earlier, the Manichaeans, being, shall we say, of somewhat easy morality and uncertain political loyalty, were persecuted by the Christians, later on when they came in contact with them, by the Muslims, and oddly enough by the Buddhists, who we don't generally associate with religious persecution. Nevertheless, they have their share. And the Manichaeans were disliked by everyone. The first version sort of passed away, but from time to time there would be, as we'll see, eruptions of it. Now, I had mentioned that the church had to learn to get along after the fall of the Roman Empire with heretical barbarian kings. Eventually, these were all replaced with Catholic ones. And at the same time, they had another issue. There were Jews, of course, settled throughout Western and Eastern Europe. And they, as Jews, not accepting Christ, not accepting the church, were given autonomous settlements to live in. We call these ghettos. And the thing about the ghettos is that they were outside Christian law. They were administered by their own rabbis under Jewish law. Again, they were strangers. They were not part of the body politic. Depending on where and when you were, this could be a very peaceful, constructive, creative relationship sometimes. And sometimes it wasn't, which we've heard, I'm sure, a lot about at different times from different people. A new player entered the game in the 600s, and that were the Muslims. And they, of course, overwhelmed Christian Egypt, Christian Syria, the Holy Land, pushed into Asia Minor, and overwhelmed Christian North Africa, and eventually Christian Spain, at different times taking as well Sicily and other places. From that time on, a large part of the history of Christendom has been the battle between the cross and the crescent. But again, it was not always a violent one. And there were port cities where the Muslims had separate trading quarters under their own law. But again, outside the body politic. All the while this was going on, Western European and eventually Eastern European monarchies, Christian monarchies, were developing. You had the Byzantine Empire, of course, but eventually the Franks, the resurgent Spanish kingdoms, the Scandinavian kingdoms, Hungary, the Holy Roman Empire, Britain, Scotland, Ireland, well, England, I mean to say. All of these developed as Catholic kingdoms, and most of them developed various coronation rites. Now, what's interesting about these coronation rites for our purposes, you just saw one recently with King Charles III, in May, is that they all had oaths of various kinds, requiring the king to maintain the law, to defend his people, to repair that which had been broken, and so on. But inevitably, it was also to defend the rights of the church and to, as far as he could, extirpate heresy. And this was a universal thing in Catholic monarchy. However, heresy in those days was seen as a twofold thing. On its sort of more academic side, it was up to the church to refute, for church councils to condemn various heretical ideas. If they went from being theoretical to being, shall we say, active, then it fell to the state to try to restrain them. Because bear in mind that a stubbornly held, contumaciously, there's another word for it, like obstreperous, a contumaciously held heresy against the judgment of the church was seen as treason to the state. Again, like communism or Nazism in later days to various countries with which we're more familiar today. And it's also important to bear in mind that the vast majority of people supported these laws and supported the suppression of heresy for the same reason the vast majority of people supported the opposition to communism and Nazism. At any rate, there was a huge uptake beginning in the 11 and especially the 1200s in Manichaeanism, again, under different forms. Came from the East, again, where Manichaeanism had sort of retreated, into the Byzantine Empire, became very big in Bosnia, where they were called the Bogomils, and Bulgaria, and then spread into Italy and France, and to a degree Spain. Their generic name was Cathar, which meant perfect, and their local name in southern France was Albigens, from the town of Albi, where they were very powerful, because they acquired, amongst various feudal lords, converts and allies. Now, this new version of Manichaeism turned out to be very, very, very hard to deal with, and very threatening. Why? Because in addition to everything we said before, they were very much opposed to human authority, very much opposed to the kings, very much opposed to the church. What made it even worse is that in a lot of places at that period, the lifestyles of the clergy weren't much better than they are now in various areas. And as a result, although the Cathar faithful were not expected to lead very moral lives, their quasi-clergy were. And these people were called the perfecti. They were supposed to be celibate, vegetarian, non-drinking. And it was believed that you had to become one of the perfecti before you died, or you'd go to hell, basically, or at least be reborn in another body, which was just a terrible, terrible idea. Moreover, they did not believe in marriage or in procreation, and thus their sexuality was very perverse. They believed that the sexual act was, although it was, unless you were one of the perfecti, impossible to control, on the one hand. On the other hand, everything should be done to keep it from resulting in procreation. You can imagine what resulted from that. The other thing about it was that, as I say, you were expected to become a perfectus if you wanted to save your soul. So what often happened is that when people felt they were dying, they would become perfecti. They'd go through the rite of the consolamentum, as it was called, and become a perfectus. But sometimes, of course, people would recover, and now they're stuck with this status. What to do? Well, if you didn't feel you could live by it, they went for suicide, which was also seen as a good thing among them because it meant you were escaping this prison of flesh. Well, This spread very strongly in different places, and especially in southern France in the 1200s. To combat it, a man named Dominique de Guzman founded the order of preachers to preach against them. Unfortunately, try as he might, a lot of them wouldn't listen, and several of his missionaries were killed. In reprisal, the King of France and various lords appealed to the Pope, and a crusade was declared, the Albigensian Crusade. What could not be accomplished through peaceful means was accomplished through the fire and sword, which was resisted, mind you. The Albigenses were quite good at killing people themselves. So it took on a very Civil War-like aspect. In the end, they were defeated, and that, to a great degree, was the end of the Albigenses, if not the Cathari. It was in the wake of this that an institution was begun called the Roman Inquisition, or the Medieval Inquisition. And this was with the help of both local bishops. It was a set of church courts with the help of local bishops and with the help of the local state to root out both heresy and immorality in general. Interestingly enough, the patron saint of the Inquisition was St. Peter of Verona, St. Peter Martyr, who had been a Cathar himself. He was Italian. He was on his way to a meeting when he was waylaid by Cathars who claimed that they wanted to convert. Well, they attacked him with axes. And as he lay dying, he dipped his finger in his blood and wrote on the pavement, "Credo, I believe." And so he became the patron saint of the Inquisition, as it was then. For many years of the Middle Ages, usually with the Dominican or Franciscan or both, the Inquisition worked very hard to root out, especially Catharism, but some of the other heresies that arose. Now, it's important to bear in mind that they had a very strict procedure, as all church courts did, and very much unlike the civil courts of the period. In the Middle Ages, they had things in civil courts like trial by combat, trial by ordeal, where you'd walk across burning coals and that kind of thing to determine guilt or innocence. Church courts were very different. They had a whole set of intricate procedures. One of the things about the Inquisition is that, in truth, very, very few people were actually executed as a result of their experience. Why? Well, first and foremost, the Inquisition was seen not as being primarily for punishment, but correction. So, first and foremost, a person is denounced to the Inquisition. Several things happen. While you're not told who your accuser is, you are asked to make a list of your 10 worst enemies. If the accusers are on that list, the whole thing is quashed right there. No more. End of story. Then, presuming that he's not, you're asked if you, in fact, believe this sort of thing. Do you believe it? Well, if you deny it, and you reject it, then you're given some sort of penance, and off you go. If you admit it, that you do believe whatever it might be, then that is when they'll begin to attempt to convince you to give it up. Only if they fail to convince you will you be turned over to the civil arm. And normally, with the vast majority of cases that went before the Inquisition, the sentence was some sort of penance. Very, very few people were turned over to the civil arm to be executed. Because once you went away from the Inquisition into the civil courts, it went from being a question of religion to a question of treason. And of course, then as now, treason is a major issue Um, I think in most countries, even today, it still goes for the death penalty. But that was the medieval Inquisition. Both Ferdinand and Isabella of Spain and their contemporary ruler in Portugal faced a major issue. One was that they now had a lot of Jewish and Muslim citizens who, of course, could not really be complete members of the state. Moreover, their other subjects, well, how do I put this, began to attack them. If that weren't bad enough, there was a tremendous fear with the expansion of the Ottoman Navy into the Western Mediterranean and the ongoing raids and so on, that there would be an attempt at a counterattack and that the resident Jews and Muslims would join them, would assist them. Now, mind you, a great many Jews and Muslims converted in Spain, and a lot of these folk were quite sincere. St. Teresa of Avila's family comes to mind. Some were not. And this was shown in a number of different ways, various plots and so forth, especially after the decision was made to send the Jews and Muslims to the Ottoman Empire, to North Africa or to Turkey. And Turkish ships arrived and took them away, which is interesting when you think about it, that the Ottomans would have done that. But they did it, and so off they went. That left, of course, some of their converso co-religionists were, as I say, sincere, but few were not. And they became a particular question of interest for the Inquisition, which now became a state instrument in Spain and Portugal, although its methods remained very similar to what they had been as purely church things. The other thing was that when the Protestant revolt came up, the Inquisition added looking for crypto-Protestants to its menu. But again, I explained before the criteria under which they worked, and it's interesting to note, bearing in mind that they were also responsible for moral offenses, that in the province of Aragon, more shepherds were executed for unrepentant bestiality than heretics. It's kind of a disgusting statistic, but now you know it. And having known it, it can't be unknown. Anyway, the very best book on the entirety of the topic, which I should recommend while I'm thinking of it, is William Thomas Walsh's Characters of the Inquisition, which goes into great detail about its administration and the three versions of the Inquisition. Why do I say three? Well, we've had the medieval, and we've had the Spanish/Portuguese. Now, there was some thought about having a similar institution in France. It was decided not to. And what happened? Well, France and Spain had Spain and Portugal rather had the Inquisition, and some few heretics in the end absolutely refused to give up whatever their heresy was, were handed over to the secular arm, and were executed. But Spain and Portugal did not undergo civil wars. France refused that sort of thing. And the result, I'm sorry to say, were the horrible wars of religion, starting with the War of the Three Henries in the early 1500s, in the mid 1500s, and going on really until about 1590. It was a terrible thing. It devastated France. Spain and Portugal were spared that. The religious conflicts in Germany and the British Isles, of course, were similarly bloody. I'm willing to say that because of the Inquisition, Spain and Portugal were spared all of that bloodshed. I know that's not a very popular thing to say, but that's where we are. That's what it was. Well, the church as a whole responded to the Protestant threat with the creation of a new congregation of the Inquisition. And this was specifically aimed toward Catholics, particularly clerics, teachers, etc., and in the Papal States toward citizens. And the Roman Inquisition, as it was called, functioned from its founding in the 1500s to combat Protestantism and other heretical ideas, all the way until today. It went through various permutations, and of course, as first the Protestant revolt, and then the French and other ensuing revolutions of the 19th century came along, the dictates of the Roman Inquisition no longer had any secular weight. They became purely in-house church disciplinary things. In Spain and Portugal, their respective state inquisitions were abolished after various revolutions in the 1830s. And from that time on, the church basically has only had the ability to judge her own members, no one else.